This is where I'll start. Now, my review of the movie Sinners is going to primarily be based on the way that I see things. I understand that can vary from person to person, but it's really down to my perspective. Your input is welcome, so are your critiques, for better or for worse, but just try to understand what I'm trying to say. Now, the first thing we start off with the movie Sinners actually achieving is a black movie, obviously, right? There aren't many of them that are intriguing, that aren't just trauma. To an extent, this one is racial trauma, but it is somewhat based on some things you might see in history, so hit or miss on that front. We'll start it off like this. We are introduced to a number of characters. While they're fine in and of themselves, what those characters end up standing for is very undefined and vague. For those of you who don't get what I'm saying here, the two Smoke twins are portrayed as these well-known troublemakers, right? They are not to be messed with. They're successful, they have money. However, this portrayal of black masculinity leans heavily into a number of stereotypes, not only about what makes a man, but also regarding of a number of stereotypes. If you see the Smokestack twins, one of the first things you'll notice is they are very well dressed. That's fine, nothing wrong with that, but relative to the people around them, their wealth is fairly isolated. You don't really see it going toward helping them. In fact, one of the first things they want to do is exploit their own community rather than save it. And that is something that is notable in the way that they behave. Now, even though there's this supposed conflict between the brothers for a brief moment regarding the people paying with what is effectively false money or bargaining chips, that's not real, because even though that plot point is brought about, it's still something that's quickly dealt with, and again, it's a currency that's honored within that community, so it really doesn't mean anything. They're still getting their money's worth or their wealth. Another thing that I would also like to say is that most of the twins' actions and activities involve violence or coercion by exploiting the weaknesses of others. So, for example, how do they get the jazz player to recognize Sammy or come down to their store? They give him a beer. So they're exploiting his alcoholism. How do they get people to their store? They are exploiting their miserable lives and their desire for entertainment, which is fine because everyone wants to be entertained, but they are specifically seeking to do this. Now, this might be a nitpick because I'm just already feeling a sort of way about the movie, so it's a nitpick. They need an enterprise. One of the stranger things in the movie is when that little girl is approached by, I believe, Smoke. And one of the first things, that's one of the twins, and one of the first things he does is this very uncomfortable scene where he's talking to her. And one of the big things in the black community is don't talk to strangers, but here she is talking to this very strange man, getting in his car and watching it for him. And for some strange reason, there are black men that start stealing in broad daylight from the truck. This little girl is in, even though they've seen the man come out. They know he's a Smoke twin, and they don't care. Now, personally, There's this peculiar thing that happens with this in that it's saying black men steal, they don't have jobs, they work, again, it's not saying all of the characters who are black men do this, but without a counter narrative in this setting, this is what you're left with. Now, you do see men in the fields working, however, we don't actually see them enterprise on any, notable scale. They're just out here toiling away, and I guess they're picking cotton in these fields. That's what they bring to town and sell. It's the order of the day. There are other jobs, but they're few and far between, especially if you're black. That's part of the setting. However, I would like to point out that Smoke Twins employ violence in a number of ways that are just strange. For example, when they're selling to the initial, I guess he's revealed to be a Klansman, but when they're selling to him initially, one of the things that we are told, or what we see, is that they were already willing to employ threats and violence, even though within the context of the setting it makes no sense to do so. Also, the Klansman trying to get rid of them at the end of the movie also doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I mean, he needs money. These guys have money. Why would he openly antagonize a group of community? Because we'd be assuming that there's some semblance of balance, even though they're separated. But let's grant that he just now wants to just get the money and kill them, and I guess he's gonna falsify documents and take back the settlement. That's not gonna go over too well, all in all, with the town, because it's a small town. Even though they don't seem to be living in the same areas, there seems to be some overlap and not a lot of gatekeeping. At least we're not shown the gatekeeping in this town. So, again, I'm not saying things like this can't happen, but it's strange that they would resort to violence knowing their disposition. Another thing that we are confronted with would be the love interests of the Smokestack twins. These women, well, for the sake of my argument, we'll call them black women. These women are just without virtue. They are vulgar, they are unrefined and unrestrained, and even the musician, I believe he's called Sammy, he is also one of the main characters, and he is vulgar, lustful, and without restraint. He has no real sense of honor in taking a man's wife, a married man's wife. And then I'll segue into the depiction of black women. The adulterous woman who ends up with Sammy, the thing that I find strange here is that she didn't look like anything was wrong with her. She was fine. And I mean fine in the sense of she didn't have any bruises. She wasn't being abused in her marriage, at least visibly from what we can see. She was being taken care of. She had fancy clothing. She had time and leisure. Apparently she also works in the fields, so her husband isn't all too far away. I guess he was tired from work and didn't go to the juke joint or party. Another thing that I like to nitpick as well is the dance. During the scenes where we're seeing the dances and the various styles of music, one of the women briefly shown is in a contemporary setting, and she is gyrating. However, she's not doing so in the manner of a traditional dance. She is just, it's an overly sexualized form of dance that to me really cheapens the entire scene, because her clothes are not that of a woman with wealth or dignity. They are that of a harlot And I'm willing to say that because I don't think that's what we should be depicting when we think of just black women in black media, because that is what this is about ultimately. Another thing is that the root worker also doing all of that in her shack. That was sort of odd because we'd think about the idea of things being sacred, a sacred space, right? She's doing these things in that same shack. Again, supposedly helping, healing, medicines, and just doing all of that filth in that shack. Why? Also, it's very surface level. It doesn't touch on the nuances of various forms of African folk religions or forms of spirituality. Oftentimes, people shy away from the word religion when talking about African systems of spirituality and belief. But again, they are religions. They are just not necessarily working on the exact same paradigm as others, but shamanism is shamanism and animism and ancestor worship aren't unique to the African continent. So I think people get too comfortable with the word spirituality, separating it from religion, but they're intertwined. It's very surface level. I didn't like it. It was strange, odd, and an uncomfortable scene, unnecessary for the story. And this movie really didn't seem like it was about the Black Plight, but it wasn't quite about monsters and vampires. I get you can find certain comparisons, stand-ins, but it's not very clear. And what I mean by that is this. You really needed to pick a struggle with this movie because on the one end, we're seeing this very odd meshing together of these two genres, almost as though people needed the movie to be about more than just the struggle. And the struggle being both supernatural and grounded in the real world is fine, but it wasn't combined properly. And that's one of the issues. Why weren't they combined properly? Let me explain what I mean here. The monster in this movie is effectively a vampire. Now, this vampire that we are introduced to functions in a very particular way. When he turns other people into vampires or ghouls, he himself obtains their memories and so forth. So he's a hive mind. Now, I would think that his being a hive mind creature to a certain extent would create for some interesting conflicts because he now has all these people's memories. He's been shown to be able to learn languages and gain their abilities and knowledge and all manner of things, right? Just from turning them. Why wouldn't this effect work in reverse to where he's turning these people and he's gaining this knowledge, but every time he turns them, his personality also shifts based on what he learns, and he's sort of going through lifetimes just by way of turning people. And so what could have happened is that at the very first he turns to Klansman. Perhaps he would have then had some very negative ideas and views. However, maybe later on we learn that, well, because he doesn't very much like the Klansmen, and he's turned black people before, he starts to have these weird clashing views in his head, right? And he has to rectify them by making decisions or thinking about them. One of the things that we also didn't see with this is that the characters he turned, they all love and care about certain people, so wouldn't that affect his behavior? That would have been an interesting plot point. We didn't see it. Also, some very strange inconsistencies regarding the monster. If he gains the memories of those he's turned, and the others knew they were going to be attacking in the morning, Why didn't he just wait? Well, let's put it like this. Why did he not wait till early in the morning, or maybe slightly before that, and target the clan first? He knew they were going to have a juke joint, so if he wanted to get the maximal number of victims, he could have gone after the clansmen, are the people who were going to attack the juke joint, and then he could have gone after the people of the juke joint themselves by, turning a select few, the leadership. They attack the juke joint, you know, and then drive them out or cause issues and problems. The sheriff shows up because the sheriff is turned. And so they shut down the juke joint for the night because they need a permit or license, some sort of excuse that they can make up. The people go outside and they're searched, and they cooperate because they don't want any trouble, and this is when the vampires strike. That would have been a perfect way to do it. And of course, at this point, even the other people, co-conspirators who were attacking you could say the black group, they would also be of the mind of, hey, something's off here. And they would rebel against the lead vampire and all the other ghouls. And then the straggling survivors could be a group of the Smokestack twins, a handful of the main cast, and a handful of white characters who perhaps instead of trying to annihilate them, were going to try to harass them and try to hinder their business and get them to leave so that they could just take over what was already there. So that's something that I thought about as being a better alternative than just an all-out free-for-all that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, the Asian woman letting the vampires in makes no sense because, again, why would she do this? If they wanted to kill her daughter, they could. They know where she is. They know where they're gonna be, right? They know everything about them because, again, they got the husband, the Asian woman's husband, the father of their daughter. So her letting them in is just nonsensical, and it makes no sense. Now, if they just waited out and taken their time, they would have been fine. But it still makes no sense to me. Now, that's all I have to say. The cinematics of the movie, fairly wonderful. If we're talking about the presentation, I thought it was alright. However, I don't think this is the greatest movie ever made, nor do I think it should be praised just because it's a black movie. And so because a lot of movies that tend to feature black people aren't made in such high quality or with a half decent script even, people are praising it and calling it amazing even though it's just an okay-ish movie that ultimately has a number of anti-black narratives, including, again, the excessive use of violence in regards to black men. It also has this hidden subtext of the smokestack twins' wealth, right, coming from criminal enterprise or involvement with crime, sort of implying that, hey, these wealthy, successful black men are criminals, so black success and excellence is inextricably tied to crime and wrongdoing and wrongness and evil. That's not good. There are no counter narratives in this story. You can mention the preacher, but the preacher is not part of it all. It's all a mess of a movie, and the fact that so many black people, especially because it's about black people and black culture, and there are commonalities globally with black people, so that's why I'm sort of speaking globally. that so many black people love this movie speaks volumes about the degradation of the culture. That's all I have to say. And I'm not a Puritan as such. I'm just someone pointing out that ultimately, if you look at what happens, this is a very anti black movie. And I know people are going to talk about woke. Are you too woke for your own good? But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not one of those people. But I will say that if you just look at what's happening in the movie, and if you were to almost jot it down without caring about some of the context for the plot, and you just wrote down, this is what happens, this is what happens, this is what happens, it's a series of very strange coincidences. And given that everything in a movie is purposeful, I think that Sinners is an anti-black movie that sort of just incorporated and co-opted the black plight to sell tickets, to pander to black people, while simultaneously adding a horror element through the vampires or monsters, but it didn't properly understand the monster, which is why we are left with this strange movie that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That's my personal opinion. I think that they could have done better, but that's just me. Leave your thoughts in the comments, like or dislike. I won't say anything more than that. Personally, Sinners is just that, a movie made to appeal to sinners, ultimately. It's barely it's not even uplifting, it's just struggle. It's just negativity. Now, one thing that I will say for my closing thoughts is that the monster could have been used to actually alleviate the black plight. So he could have, started controlling the white population, which in this context would be those in power, and over time start influencing the citizenry to treat black people better. Now, the Smokestack twins would come in and they would find this odd and strange, and at a certain point in the climax of the movie, where they're maybe investigating certain discrepancies in behaviors and disappearances and the mob that they double cross to obtain all that liquor and who knows what, because this seems to be somewhere in the area of prohibition or whatever, they would basically be closing in on them, and while this is happening, all these mobsters start disappearing, and so the mob thinks it's the Smokestack twins, but it's actually not. It's the vampires who are sort of protecting slash figuring out how they're going to get the black populace on their side, right? Because the vampires' idea is that they're going to expand outward, and because of the master vampire's idyllic view of the world, he's trying to create this deranged utopia where the people of the town, some are vampires, some are not. They don't feed on the people of the town, but they sort of have the people in power be vampires, which basically ensures his control and also allows for, an unbroken rule, quote unquote, while they leave some of the townspeople as livestock or people who will act as their protectors during the day while they're sort of spreading outward during the night. This would also sort of be perfect for them running their own shenanigans, right? Because they have the element of supernatural powers, the night, and so forth. And so this could be a great big plot, the Smokestack twins foil, because they love their people and they will not accept the evil of racial injustice or the evil of the supernatural corrupt trying to sell them that paradise that isn't real. So it could have been this really great movie, but that's not what we got. We got this very strange, again, mismatch. It wasn't really a supernatural horror movie. It wasn't really a black plight movie. It was just this lukewarm mess that we didn't need. That's my personal opinion. I'll leave it at that.